Take 1 second and have people quickly go around and just
Yeah. You can.
introduce themselves. So I'm Ian Cook with the Neponset Watershed Association.
Oh, I'm Alejandra Narvaez. I'm with the trustees of reservations. So we've been on the project team as more of an advisory role to NEPRA.
My name is Isa. I'm the energy manager at Neponset.
Adam Graham from Cedar Grove in Dorchester.
Sean McCanty, River Restoration Director for NEPRA.
Keith Johnson, Quincy Climate Action Network.
And then we missed.
I'm Meher Kanda. I am the environmental science fellow at NEPRA.
Erin Gross Horan, Community Engagement Strategy at NEPRA.
How about the online people?
Oh, this is hard to do with their screen sharing, isn't it?
Can't see them.
There we go.
Oh, there you go.
Natalie, do you want to introduce yourself, or Pippa?
Sure, yeah, I can kick us off. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie. I'm a designer and planner at Scape, supporting Pippa. I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I'm Pippa Brashear. I'm the resilience principal at Scape, a landscape architect and planner, and I'll kick it over to our other teammate, Kirk.
Hi, everybody. Kirk Bosma. I'm a coastal engineer with Woods Hole Group, and we've teamed with Scape on this project. And I'll go to Sarah, DCR.
Thank you. Sarah White. I'm the director of the Office of Climate Resilience at DCR. Happy to be here virtually. I'll pass it over to Stella from DCR.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm Stella Lansing. I'm a project manager in the Trails and Greenways section at DCR. Do I need to kick it to? I'll kick it to Maria Lyons.
You're muted, Maria.
Okay, sorry. I'm Maria Lyons. I live in Port Norfolk in Dorchester, and I'm a board member for NEPRA. Am I the last one?
Paul.
I'm Paul on this one, yeah. My name is Paul Kirshen. I'm a professor at UMass in Boston, and I'm advisor to the project. And I think I'm it, right?
Yeah, you can't see the whole screen.
Oh, we got full head there. Yeah.
Megan, you there? How about Kevin?
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Kevin McHugh with Conoco Engineers and Scientists, and we work with the city of Quincy.
Excellent. Paul, you want to introduce yourself, Paul?
Sure. This is Paul Costello. I'm the city engineer for the city of Quincy, and I'm here with Kevin McHugh from Conoco and Megan, also from Conoco.
I think that's it.
It looked like Megan unmuted herself.
Okay.
All right, I think we can go ahead.
All right. So am I supposed to set the scene here?
I think you are.
All right. So thank you for being here tonight. It's been a good while since we've seen everybody, and we've sort of come a long way. The team has done a lot of work and has a lot of really interesting information for you tonight. And along the way, your input has been really helpful, even though it's all seemed a little abstract and there were too many cases and scenarios and everything. It's now, in some ways, it's now a little simpler because the analysis has really been done based on your input, and we have some of the conclusions. So we're excited about that. And tonight we're going to get a lot of information about flooding in these three communities, a lot of information about how marshes and neighborhoods along the river are going to be increasingly affected by flooding in the future, and also the role that healthy salt marshes could potentially play in helping to manage some of those challenges. And there's a lot to take in here, but I would just sort of highlight a couple things that have really struck me as I've sort of been watching the Scape and Woods Hole folks kind of develop this information over the last few months. You know, one is that it gives you a really good sense of what flooding is going to look like at different degrees of severity over the next 50 years in the Neponset estuary. It gives you a really good sense of how salt marshes themselves, wildlife and recreational resources that we all enjoy are going to be impacted by that flooding. It gives us a very specific sense of just how much land and infrastructure there is that is really vulnerable here. And finally, it really, frankly, for me, highlights the fact that it's really, really hard to protect both the river and the ecosystem and the development along the river the way it is now in the future. And it really kind of sets up some interesting and challenging things that have to be figured out, not necessarily all today, but over the next 50 years. And the good news in all that is one of the key takeaways that you're going to hear about tonight is that protecting and restoring the existing marshes where they are right now, not necessarily spreading to take over what's currently developed, helps a lot with flooding, at least in small, very frequent storm events that make, existing in a place very challenging. The bad news is that it is not going to, that salt marshes alone are not going to solve the whole issue. It's not going to protect us from the 100-year flood, particularly. And that it's going to be really difficult to provide that level of protection if we want to keep everything where it is right now. And frankly, to me, and this is just my opinion or my speculation, it's sort of not necessarily obvious to me that society is actually prepared to do what would have to be done, even if you're willing to build any infinite amount of hard infrastructure to keep everything the way it is. So one of the sort of interesting things that we've done here, and it's almost a thought experiment, this is not a recommendation that we take anything away, but as people over time are thinking about how to deal with those more vulnerable properties, and if they're going to do what it takes to, keep this parking lot a parking lot for the rest of time or not, we've posed the question, what if some of those developed areas were turned back into marsh as they're abandoned? Would that provide some flood benefit and some ecological benefit? And that also provides some interesting ideas here. So that's, hopefully I've probably given away some of the surprise elements here, but you're going to hear it from these guys, and hopefully the second time you hear it, it'll all make much more sense. So with that, unless people have questions at this point, I will turn it over to Scape and Woods Hole.
Yeah, I can kick us off with a little bit of an intro and a recap of where you've seen. So we've had our dinner and arrival and our welcome and introductions. And we're going to kind of do this in two parts. So we have a break in between, not talk through the whole time. We'll do a little bit of background on the project, a brief recap of the estuary today, because we've talked about these things, but just a quick refresh reminder. And then we're going to talk about evolving challenges, the future conditions without action. We've looked at that a little bit before, but now that Woods Hole Group has completed the modeling, as Ian said, we'll really be able to see and unpack some of the long-term flood risks and how that translates to some of the metrics, some of the values that you talked about before. We'll go over the goals, objectives, and metrics, how we're kind of looking at these scenarios, and then talk through what Ian alluded to, which is sort of a recommended action, what the basic sort of restoration of the marsh. Actually, I'll tell you that. We'll just kind of look through the overall restoration adaptation options, and then we'll take a break before we dig into the presentation of the modeling of those approaches that we looked last time. With, as Ian said, some recommendations, but then some additional thought experiments in terms of what are the implications of different restoration scenarios that are not necessarily recommendations, but look at the flood risk reduction implications. So next slide. You can jump to the next slide. So where we are today, remember the project area, we're really looking just at the lower Neponset up to the dam that control where it is, the Neponset is tidally influenced. And that white boundary is based on the projected flood extents of the 100-year storm in 2070. So we really want to capture everything that's considered flood risk. And it includes all three municipalities. And as I talked through, we've looked at the existing conditions. We've met before about the performance goals, and last time we talked, the model results, the flood model results of those, and start to discuss those. Next slide. So just want to go back to the project purpose, which is to really understand the implications of sea level rise on the estuary, as Ian alluded to earlier. Understand and the implications of sea level rise, not just for flooding, but for marsh loss in the lower estuary. Flood risk, potential flood reduction benefits of marshes to the estuary, and then use what we talk about today to develop a long-term marsh adaptation recommendation and identify some near-term or a near-term project that can be done to set us on that path. So the real goals of today, we wanted to lay these out because there's a lot of information to go through, but the themes today and to think about as you hear the presentation. And we really want to understand, want to all leave with a shared understanding of the value to marsh and the Neponset, thinking about it in terms of the ecosystem benefits, but what I think today will reveal some of the flood risk reduction benefits over the long term. To explore the importance of the marsh as it is today and in the future, what happens to that marsh if nothing happens. And then we're going to explore various approaches to marsh restoration, which will include adaptive restoration, adaptive management, and potentially expansion of those marshes and the implications of those for flood risk reduction. So that can help you inform your opinions. And then what we hope at the end is to hear from you and understand how the community values the marsh today. Your reactions to the findings of this study, both the future with no action and some of the adaptation approaches that we'll present, and also how you feel about the protection and associated cost for areas that are expected to be flooded more than once a month, very frequently, over the long term. Next slide. So a little bit just to get us all thinking about the estuary today. This is a land use land cover map of the estuary. Everything you see in gray is developed, the buildings, the dark gray, the buildings, the paved areas, the parking lots, the roads, but everything else is a natural system, right? And so that brighter, lighter green that you see is the marsh. The tan is the mudflat and the blue is open water, and that comprises about 40% of the estuary. So even today, about 40% of this entire study area is tidally influenced and part of that ecosystem, with about 16% being the actual marsh. It's also an urban estuary, right? It is within that developed area, we have over 2,000 buildings, over 65 miles of transportation infrastructure, including 45 miles of roads, 16 miles of trails and greenways, a lot of recreational assets, and over 3 miles of railroads, as well as over 4,000 residential units. So that's not that many buildings, but individual residential units between the single and multifamily building, and almost 300 acres of open space that is not tidally influenced. Next slide. And then there's the estuary itself, right? This is a drowned river estuary. It's designated an area of critical environmental concern because it is ecologically valuable and rich, but also because it is at risk. It's heavily impacted by humans' development and uses. Next slide. And as part of, based on the state of the estuary analysis and report that Woods Hole Group did, we've identified a number of different sub-marsh complexes, right? This is one estuary, this is one system, but they're independent areas, and have looked at those in terms of their health and threat today, right? So the green ones you've seen here are relatively high health. They're at a good elevation. They show healthy vegetation. Yellow is moderate, and high is is this poor health, high vulnerability, meaning they might be low or not at the right elevation for marsh. They have a heavy invasives. They have issues with hydrologic connectivity. But this is one place to start when we think about the health of the marsh today. Next slide. And so while the marsh, there are reasons for restoration and adaptation today because of that health. Over time, with sea level rise, we see increasing threats to the marsh health itself. And I'm going to turn it over to Natalie to talk through that.
Thanks, Pippa. So yeah, here on the right-hand side, you can see the estuary again, and we're really going to take a few minutes to talk about how the tidal datums are expected to change in the future. And again, these are projections. We're explicitly using 2030 and 2070 scenarios from the state under the high emission scenario selected. And so that's looking at about 1.2 and 4.3 feet of sea level rise for 2030 and 2070, respectively. And you can see that, again, in 2024, Woods Hole Group did a great in-depth estuary study that gave us sort of our mean high water present day. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at that 2030 mean high water and 2070 mean high water. And we've circled in blue on the right-hand side a few of those areas that are pretty stark, right? So anywhere in that light blue is projected to flood potentially daily under mean high water conditions by 2070. And so when we're considering what that might mean for land use and land cover and how the estuary might change by 2070, again, under a no action scenario, this would be like the hands off. We don't do anything to protect the marshes. They're sort of left as is. Without intervention, the marsh elevations would remain static while those sea levels rise. So if you look back to those charts we just looked at, we're seeing over time how those tidal datums will rise. And if we do nothing, we'll essentially lose the marsh to that open water. So the marsh areas will primarily become mudflat due to that sea level rise, which would include eroded edge conditions and that lost marsh from 2016. We do keep some remaining marsh in the projections. That's that bright green area on the right-hand side, but it's pretty minimal. So when we look at that acreage overall, by 2070, the projections tell us that we'd lose around 70% of the existing marsh land cover today. And so just highlighting some of those more specific areas along Commander Shea Boulevard, you can see a lot of that has turned to open water, if not mud flat, and also extensive loss along Riverside Avenue, along Milton and Quincy border there. Something we want to call attention to as well is this marsh to open water ratio. Kirk, I don't know if you actually can chime in here. It's something that you'll see at the bottom of a lot of these marsh charts, but it's something we wanted to highlight.
Yeah, so one of the key things that we're looking at in a system like the Neponset is, a lot of times when we think about marshes and how it interacts with coastal storms, we think about places like Louisiana where you have really expansive marshes that extend forever and ever, and you're trying to essentially stop the power of the ocean, which is hard to do given the size of the ocean. So when we think about these estuaries and marshes up the estuary, there's this ratio between what volume of water are we trying to stop versus the area of marsh that you have. And one of the interesting things about these estuarine type marshes like you have in the Neponset is maybe that ratio between the available marsh area versus the open water area becomes a level where the marsh actually does start to have more value for stopping, storm surge from coming into an area. It's a lot less likely to function when you have a case of, a small marsh on the edge of the ocean. If you're out on the Atlantic Ocean, because the ocean's so big, you're not going to stop that water from coming in. But in this estuary, maybe that's probable. And so we're looking at things like, hey, if you can keep that open water to marsh ratio high, then perhaps that's a real benefit for flood reduction measures.
Thanks. Yeah, and you'll see that kind of reoccurring on these as we progress through the approaches. We also wanted to take a moment to sort of set up this idea of marsh migration, this idea that marsh health and marsh existence is really tied to those tidal datums. And Massachusetts has specific modeling for this, the sea level affecting marshes model. And you'll see on the right-hand side, everything in yellow is where that model SLAM projects marsh might migrate by 2070. And within our project area, that would be an additional 124 acres of marsh. But as we just looked at, and you can see on the right-hand side with that red diagonal hatch, we would still be losing over 200 acres of marsh to sea level rise. So we're just wanted to call out here while we're really interested in marsh expansion, and we'll be talking about that a lot today. If we don't do enough to protect the existing marsh, we'll still be at a net loss of marsh in the estuary due to sea level rise. And here, maybe Kirk and I can kind of tag team, but we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the different flood zones that we're using in this research. And we've really set up based on sort of industry standards, but also how this estuary functions. And we've introduced a different zone that's maybe new to the team. I think Pippa already introduced it, but this idea of areas that would be flooded roughly 12 times a year, or at least in a monthly scenario. Kirk, if you can walk us through a little bit.
Yeah, so we're using, the flood extent, where basically the water goes is a primary metric to assess how the marsh is functional in terms of providing protection. And the real purpose here of the project is trying to figure out, what is the marsh really capable of doing in terms of flood protection? And if that changes, what does that mean in terms of what happens with flooding? So this case in 2030 is a really pretty reasonable representation of what we would see today. And those different colors, as you get darker, mean you flood more and more often. So as Natalie mentioned, the dark blue is something that would occur at least once a month. And you can see most of that area throughout the system is something that's already open water, marsh, or mud flat. So it's not like today we see tons of flooding in upland areas or anything like that on a monthly type basis. As you get lighter and lighter in the color shades of blue, you start to see, storm events. So flooding at least one time a year, like an annual type condition. Flooding between 10%, which is a 10-year return period storm, and an annual event. What do you have then? And then all the way down to kind of that 1% or 100-year return period level. And we're using annual exceedance probability to kind of represent that, which means, a 1% chance is a 1% chance you're going to see that in any given year. So if you look at the map, that lighter blue areas indicate areas that would potentially flood under those different scenarios. Not tons of areas, but it certainly does extend into certain developed locations throughout the area and gets worse and worse under bigger storm events. So that's kind of what you're faced with today. If we then start to draw that out into the future and look what we might be facing in 2070 using the state standard sea level rise conditions, and that's a pretty high estimate. So maybe 2070 is really more like 2100 or 2120. But you can see how that risk changes. Again, those same color shades where the dark blue is monthly and the lighter blues go to larger, less frequent storm events. You can see how the blue has expanded throughout the entire area. And now even monthly conditions are expanded into developed areas outside the hatching, which is kind of the existing tidal locations. And the bar graphs on the left-hand side show what this really means for some of the estuaries assets throughout the area. So from a residential unit area in 2030, you could get up to under a 1% annual chance event, 686 units flooded, but that jumps all the way up to almost 3,000 in a 2070 condition at the 1% level. And you can see specifically the dark blue in that bar chart indicates has increased on a monthly level. And so you didn't have anything flooding under a monthly condition in 2030, but you're starting to see that occur on a monthly basis. And those monthly values are tide-based conditions. These are not storms that occur. This is something that would naturally occur as the highest tide condition once a month. Same thing with buildings. You're up 1,000 buildings, 22 miles of roads, and over 78 additional acres of open space that flood. So this is a case where we just don't do anything. The marsh degrades. It isn't high enough to support marsh. There's edge erosion that occurs, and this is what kind of you'd be facing in a 2070 condition. And so what's the takeaways under, kind kind of this no action condition going forward in the future is, well, if we don't take any steps, any measures at all to help the marsh system here, we're going to expect to lose, around 71% of the existing marsh. And that's with, that 4 plus a little bit of feet of sea level rise. So, when that occurs is, uncertain, but certainly we're trending in a direction where we know sea level is going up. And what that also drives is the dramatic expansion, as we just saw in the flood risk throughout the area, whether it's monthly normal tidal conditions or less frequent storms like an annual storm, or more frequent storms like an annual storm, or less frequent storms like the 100-year type condition. So losing marsh and increasing flooding is the key takeaways for the no action type assessment. Okay, so let me go over the project goals, objectives, and metrics a little bit here. Go to the next slide. So given that risk that we're facing, both to the marsh itself and coastal flooding, we're really trying to assess what the value of the marsh is on these two kind of pathways or tracks, if you will. One of them is the estuary ecosystem itself. So the marsh has value, right? There's habitat value, biodiversity, fisheries impacts, carbon sequestration, right? So there's this track of, if we can take actions, how can we help the estuary out? And then interrelated to that is, well, what does that marsh then do for flood risk, right? So there's the estuary value itself, but then there's also, can that in some way provide reduced present day and future coastal flood risk for not just the marsh itself, but obviously the assets, infrastructure, homes, properties, transportation network that we have surrounding the marsh. And so that's really the primary goal here. And that first track is the habitat and ecological value. So there's ecosystem services values that the marsh provides. I mentioned the fish, the birds, all utilize this space. There's specific evaluation metrics that go along with that health. For example, nutrient filtration services are about $14,000 per year, 1 acre for just 1 acre of salt marsh, and 9,820 acres of nursery services and habitat services related to fish that come out of this. Even the fisheries, the marshes serve as excellent, nurseries for fisheries, and that leads to, if you like to eat fish, this is where they start and come from. So if you lose all the marshes, you're going to have fish problems as well in the future. So there's even food value out of this. So there's one track that we're looking at here, which is, okay, if we can keep the marsh healthy, keep it serving its function, there's value in that. Next slide. And then there's also this flood risk reduction piece that we're looking at. It provides that first line of defense for the infrastructure areas. It can reduce erosion, attenuate waves. We're looking at that storm surge capacity. It's like a big sponge that kind of helps the system respond to increased water levels, whether that's sea level rise itself or sea level rise coupled with storms. So by just maintaining the ecosystem value, then do we get in turn some flood reduction benefits? And we're looking at specific metrics there related to, what floods to the extent. We also are taking a little bit of a look at how depth changes due to marshes. So sometimes you might not stop the water from getting to somewhere, but if you can reduce it by 6 inches to a foot, and you know the difference between at your house if you have just 6 inches of water that doesn't reach your doorstep, right? Or if you have a foot that's flowing in your front door, there's a pretty big difference there. So, we're looking at some of those pieces here related to the marsh. Next slide. There's also some additional considerations we're looking at for recreational and cultural value, things like carbon sequestration into the future. How can the marsh then support, climate change reductions itself? It's a big thing for urban heat. And so there's other factors that come into our metrics besides the two primary tracks that we're following here. Next slide. Okay, so we understand what our risk is today a little bit and going into the future if we just let things go. And if we do let things go, that means we either have to protect our upland assets through other measures, whether that's infrastructure engineering based approaches, if we're going to keep it there, or, and we're going to lose marsh in that same respect. And we also are following these two tracks of what the marsh can do for you kind of approach here. And so next slide. Really what we're after here is kind of a learning and information gathering assessment through this process. So again, as Ian mentioned up top, none of these things that we're proposing here necessarily are projects that we're saying we're going to implement or we're going to do, or this is what you have to do. That's not really the purpose here. What we're really after is learning if we do nothing, what might happen, which we just kind of covered. And if we do start to take actions at different levels, whether it's just maintaining that existing marsh or letting it expand, what does that mean for the communities that and the ecosystem itself that surround and are part of this estuary marsh system? So we're really looking at a restore, adapt, and expand scenario throughout these kind of assessments that we're doing. What that means is restore, we're just making sure that we keep what we have today. So restore that existing marsh in the near to midterm. And there's a whole bunch of strategies that come into play there. A lot of them are being tested across the state right now. Ditch remediation, ridges and runneling. You can control the edge erosion through some marsh sills and living shoreline approaches. There's berms and culvering. There's hydrologic connections that are improving the salt distribution through the area. So if you have poorly performing or low quality health marsh now, can we just make it better? That's the first step. The second one is really adapt. So now let's say we have healthy marsh throughout the area, but it's facing a pressure from external sources, which is the water is changing. It's not the same level as it historically has been, and it's getting higher and higher. So we have to manage that in some way. And normally, right, if we weren't here and we weren't necessarily in the way, that would mean the marsh would either have sediment deposited from natural upstream values like the Neponset River itself, but we put a lot of dams in the river, so not as much sediment's coming down, so the marsh can't keep up, or it would migrate into areas where it says, hey, I really want to be here now based on what the water level's done, and it can't necessarily migrate because we've developed there too. So what are we going to do to help that marsh adapt? And there's things that we can think about in terms of elevational changes, invasive management. And so there's this adaptation stage to basically maintain and sustain what we currently have. And then finally, what if we start thinking about expansion? And so if we lose some marsh, maybe we should let it go somewhere. I mean, even if we don't lose some marsh, what does the additional marsh provide as value? And again, these aren't things we're saying need to happen. This is really a scientific investigation in terms of if we did do these things, what does that get you? What does that buy? And so we're looking at various adaptation strategies to expand that marsh, whether it's into open space that exists or maybe into parking lots that become areas where they're flooded every day, right? Do we want to invest in a really costly expense to keep that marsh not flooded every day? Or do we just say, well, okay, maybe I have to think about parking somewhere else or make an elevated system and let the marsh migrate under here and get, some value from that, whether it's flood reduction measures or just the ecosystem value of the marsh itself. So the expansion is the last step here. All right, and so though that kind of idea of going from no action where we just let everything kind of go and see what happens to, restore and adapt to what we have. And then going into the expansion leads us to these kind of 4 steps of expansion. So first piece is that restore and adapt. And that is basically modeled by looking at a case where we keep the marsh where it is now, keep up with sea level rise the best we can. And if you go to the next slide, that's really, what we need to, keep the marsh as we have. It's absolutely necessary, or we're just going to lose what we have already. And then if we go forward from that, we have, these 4 steps where we expand the marsh areas in very limited steps. So the first one, we're just doing some small natural areas, and then we go into more open space under our expansion 2 step. Under expansion 3, we don't go into areas that are developed with buildings or infrastructure, but we might go into parking lots and try to expand that way. And then the final one is kind of this, as we've been calling it, the revenge of the marsh, where we let the marsh go wherever it wants, where the elevations are right. And we kind of, that includes building areas. And so again, the idea here is not to necessarily have to do this, but to see, what does that mean? What is it, if we take those steps in expansion, what kind of happens as we go forward? So this is kind of a little bit of a sneak preview of the results. So from a conceptual perspective, what we ended up finding, and again, following these 2 tracks, right? If we're going forward from no action, we don't have a lot of benefit from that in terms of flood risk reduction. We don't have any benefits. I mean, we lost 71% of our marsh from the ecological benefits. But if we just kind of restore or keep up with what's there now, we get massive flood risk reduction benefits, which we'll see in a second. We also get, the ecosystem benefits associated with the marsh. And then if we start to do limited migration and go into assisted migration, what we're seeing is we're getting some smaller pockets of marsh gain, which results in increasing ecological benefit, but at a much slower slope of benefits. But we're not seeing really very much flood risk reduction benefits from, just taking small areas and parking lots and those type of things. So as we go from assisted migration, which is some open space taking, to expanded migration and parking areas, we're not seeing flood risk reduction benefits, primarily because we have disparate, very small marsh areas. And so the flood risk reduction benefits aren't really there, but the ecosystem value still continues to grow. So there's value in that from the ecosystem perspective, and the costs and the fisheries and the carbon sequestration going with that. And then if we get far enough along where we really start to get that marsh to open water ratio back up again through further expansion, we do start to see a gain in flood risk reduction benefits again. And then also you continue to get that ecological benefit. So that means there's, if you think about this as kind of a time continuum, that might be considered as sea level rise goes up, there's an ability to maintain your current usage, your current development for quite a while without, saying, well, it has to go to marsh right now, or, there's decisions that have to be made, which is part of the things that we're going to talk about here in terms of flood risk reduction benefits. Making small little steps might not amount to much of anything in the near term to midterm, but there will become a point where the parking lot's flooded every day. And then what do you do? Do you protect, or do you say, hey, I need to think about something differently? So keep these 2 kind of tracks in mind as we go through the results here going forward. So.
All right. Thanks, Kirk.
Yeah.
We have some time built in now. We have about a half an hour, actually, which is pretty generous for a break. If people need to get up, stretch their legs, use the restroom. But we're also hoping to start answering some questions. We know that was a lot of kind of preliminary content, and also giving you some hints to some of the results. But before we really dig into each of those 4 approaches, we wanted to see if folks have some questions. I don't know, Ian, Sean, do you guys want to take 5 minutes first for people to get up, or how's everyone feeling in the room?
What do you guys think?
Because Maria and Arthur have to drop out at 7:30. Maybe we do the questions first and then take the break after.
Sounds good.
Okay, great.
Let's
do it.
Questions.
I'm happy to jump to any slides if people want to take another look or have specific questions.
It all made perfect sense. Yeah.
Mhm.
But we didn't even get to the fun stuff yet. So that, we got,
We really got to make
So
sure everyone's on board now.
I have a couple of questions. Can you hear me, Maria?
Yeah, hi, Maria.
Hi.
Oh, because she had.
Um, when you say that the salt marsh will be flooded, I mean, how many feet over the level are you talking? And the same thing for the lands. I'm specifically worried about Port Norfolk, obviously. You say it's going to be flooded with the high tide, but what does that mean? Are you talking inches? Are you talking a foot every month? I know Chris Bush is right now over at the Port Norfolk Civic Association talking about this as well, but maybe you can give a little insight into that.
Yeah, sure. Are you talking about at the monthly level in the future, or are you
Yeah,
thinking more
I'm more
about?
concerned with the tide than the storms.
Yeah, so one easy way to think about that, and the monthly tides, tides change every day, twice a day, and then they change, on a 2-week cycle due to the moon and sun rotations. But the easy way to think about this is if you took your current high water, if you went out at Port Norfolk and looked, where high water gets to, right? Mm-hmm. Say, your spring tides, your highest tides. If you added 4 feet, like 4 to 4.5 feet to that, that's where the water would then reside. So, in Port Norfolk, you probably, again, depending on each tide that we're talking about here, but we could pull from the model exactly what that depth looks like for each case. And so monthly, we're probably not talking more than inches, but under a storm case, you're probably talking feet.
Okay, that's good to know.
And remember, like Kirk said, the scenario that we're looking at for 2070 is that plus 4.3 feet. It may happen in 2070. That's a very conservative projection. It could be 2100. But just it's that, that is the trajectory.
Yeah, the way the state kind of likes to talk about that is it's as soon as 2070. So they're trying to really make sure that communities understand and kind of don't get caught with their pants down, so to speak, because it could be 4 feet by 2070. That means it's not necessarily going to be, but as soon as 2070, it could be 4 feet. But it could also be, later than that, right? It's the soonest that could occur is in 2070.
So the marshes which are at sea level will be covered with 4 feet of water?
At high tide, yeah. So generally marshes live in the intertidal zone, right? Between mean low water and mean high water at some level. So if you think about that, right, they'll still be dry at low tide, right? If your tide range is, 6 feet, 8 feet, but more often the mean water level will be way above the marsh elevation, and then the marsh species can't really live when they're underwater as much as that, right? So this little cross section here that Natalie's shown is a good example of that, right? So in the future, you can see where the marsh is, right? And it goes above and below that. But if you add, 4 feet to everything, that's going to be a problem. So
they're going to be flooded even at a non-king tide.
They're going to be flooded. They're going to be flooded every day, twice
every
a
high
day.
Tide, yeah.
Even at mid tide, they'd be all underwater in that case, right?
Yeah.
So,
and that's why we talk about them drowning, because they, like us, they can breathe underwater, if you will. They exist at a very specific tide range. So if the water rises more quickly than they can keep up, they can't exist.
Right.
Kirk, there's a question in the chat about specific flood modeling. I don't know if that's a quick one to answer.
Yeah, so there's no, not HECRAS in this case. So we're using AdCirc coupled with UNSWAN. So it's a tightly coupled high resolution hydrodynamic and wave model that's being used for this. We also that does allow, it's a 2-dimensional model. It does allow river discharge in there as well. And then For this particular model, we're sub-modeling that with a model called SRH, which is a river hydraulic model that can also handle coastal effects to get down to resolutions. Our resolutions are on the order of like 5 to 10 feet.
So I have a question.
This is Paul Costello from the city of Quincy that asked that question. We can get into it later.
Okay, I think we've got a question from the room with Patty.
Okay, so I'm looking at this from a public policy point of view a little bit. So where the Pope John Paul Park is, used to be a dump, iron place, shredded metal, I don't know what else they had there, and the drive-in and a lot of different things. It was enormous that got taken all down over a not that long a period of time. And then they built the fields and everything in there, the more passive areas. Is there proof that that has made a big difference, at least on that portion of the river? I have a follow-up to that, but it's like, is there anything in your research to show people that if you do proactive things and put land so it's absorbing into the ground versus rolling off of parking lots? Is there anything that we have that?
Yeah, well, you can see where the arrow is that region that you're talking to.
Yeah.
There's some eroded area.
I think you're sort of asking a question that's almost coming up in the second half,
Okay.
because that's when they're gonna start, like, what they showed you so far is just like, well, what if we keep the marsh, what if we do things for the marsh where it is, it doesn't really get to move? And the next phase is like, well, what if we take some pavement out? How does that start to affect things?
So the other thing is you hear about things like, people only think about flood lines for their insurance, and they're only thinking about how much can I get and how the high cost of insurance is. But it doesn't feel like people are understanding we shouldn't necessarily be building that close. People have talked about the MRI building that's on Granite, that they want to do something different there, and potentially that you would have, I don't know, 50 units. I mean, it's a big space that you're talking about. So the impact of something like that is so long-term and is so on the edge of it all. It just doesn't seem that this is the direction you want to go in. And I'm sure there are other spots in the three communities that those kinds of things. When you look at, whoever thought Marina Bay would have as many units there? And every single time spaces that are used up there are doing the exact same thing, which I'm guessing have a very negative impact on it. Obviously, Newport Ave, we were talking about earlier, having the vast parking lots that are there are affecting today. So it's kind of interesting to see, how do people get to a point where they understand the public policy has to say something along the lines of saying, you cannot do something bigger in these areas too. Like, does that come out of your phase 2 here in the conversation today?
I don't know if Kirk or Pippo want to take that. I mean,
I think the flood analysis of the frequency gives you a more nuanced perspective of the potential flood risk of lower lying areas in that sense. I did want to emphasize that the Pope John Paul was a very large, right, landfill, and it kind of lifted it out of the floodplain, and in that sense, it doesn't flood anymore. But this analysis really looks at coastal flooding and marsh. So when Kirk jump in if I misspeak, but when we're talking about kind of conversion of parking lots, it's from the coastal flooding perspective. It's looking at where marsh can be at that low elevation. It's not the flooding that we're looking at doesn't look at or analyze that overland flooding. So like the flood coming off the parking lot or something being paved, something upland being paved or green. We're really looking and analyzing only the coastal flooding in the marsh. So, but Kirk, jump in
Yeah,
here.
just to
just wanted
clarify
kind
that
of-
a little bit more, it's
Yeah.
not that we're not looking at the effects of parking lot versus marsh or
parking
those
lot
type of
versus
things.
like
It's really
upland
this,
grass.
yeah, we're looking at all those types of things. It's the source of the flooding is what Pip is trying to get at, right? So
Sorry,
what
yes.
we're looking at is when you get a coastal event, so sourced from the ocean with salt water, right? Whether it's a small nor'easter, a big nor'easter, a hurricane, just normal tides due to sea level rise, where that water goes is what we're really focused on. What we're not looking at in this particular assessment, although we have done this in other cases, is when it rains, right? And the precipitation falls on the area. How does that flood things? Where does that go? That's another stressor, but not what we're looking at here. We're looking at coastal source or coastal based water flooding in this assessment.
If I could
And
just.
then
I would
Go
have
ahead.
to guess that grows more though when there's an area on the edge of development that is not as invasive.
Yeah,
If I could jump in for a second, I think a better example than Pope John Paul Park of what she's looking for is Finnegan Park. It was all paved over. And when they designed it, and I think this was before you, Stella, they tried to encourage the marsh to grow around the edge, which it is, and also it's leveled down to the river. And before they did Finnegan Park, the houses on the street behind it, Taylor Street and Walnut Street, would get flooded during even just minor storms. And now they're protected, and it has worked. Even with those really big storms of 2018, the entire Finnegan Park was covered with water, yet none of the houses got flooded. So it did work. So it can work. That's a small area, but it does show that it does work. And to answer the question about development, you're absolutely right. There's a huge inconsistency between the climate people in Boston and the the development people in Boston. To what should we do along the waterfront? And the development people will say they need the money, that they need a tax base. So they don't care, and they just build along the waterfront. Well, the coastal people will be telling you, the climate people will be telling you, oh, they shouldn't be building there. So even in the city, there's a huge consistency between those two groups of people.
And one thing I would just add is, so I think the answer on the modeling is we're not really modeling the freshwater component of flooding. It's like if somebody took Cedar Grove Cemetery, for example, and completely paved it, that would probably make flooding that's maybe even a little bit worse than what's shown here. But the flip side that I think all these, and we don't actually answer these questions as to what the policy should be, but the flip side is, if you're, for example, going to build a huge development at MRI, and it's in a place that is going to flood in 2070, are you dealing with the fact that you are building something in a place that is going to flood during the lifetime of that building? And who is going to deal with that? Is that going to be the homeowners who own it once the developer is long gone? Is that going to be the city who's committed to coming back and dealing with that? Like, sort of, what's the plan for making that viable in the long term is, I think, one of the questions that this raises as development progresses in all these communities.
I don't want to get into the nitty gritty details of the technical stuff, but and just to be clear, we do include freshwater flooding that's coming down the river from the watershed. So the river from the overall watershed in Neponset, we know what that flow is. That flow is included in the model. What we don't have, to Ian's point, is we don't have direct, what's called pluvial flooding or rain-based flooding falling directly on the Neponset areas or the infrastructure. So that direct rain isn't included. To that point, right? We're not looking at, like if we turn all this into marsh, that might absorb rainwater better. That's all true. But I can also tell you that if it's raining when we have a coastal storm, it doesn't matter if it's raining or not. That volume of water is infinitesimally small compared to the volume of the ocean water coming in. So, rain versus storm surge, right? We're really looking at that effect of that storm surge and monthly tide, which far outweighs the volume of rainwater. That's not to say that rain can't cause flooding, just that when there's a coastal storm, that is by far the dominant flood force.
This is Paul Costello, the city engineer in Quincy again. we have developed an inundation model for overland sheet flow to the ocean using InfoWorks ICM. It's for a closed pipe network, and it helps us decide which land areas will flood. We've looked at a wide range of scenarios with the 2070 flood and also a 100-year rainfall. And I call that the Noah's Ark scenario. Everything just floods. Squantum is an island. So designing projects, Conoco's on board. We have several coastal projects we're trying to design to. We also have, we're dealing with the FEMA flood map. So if a developer comes before the city, current law is they look at the FEMA flood maps. Our inundation modeling shows that this flooding will be about a foot above the FEMA flood maps. So in court, developers have won cases against municipalities so that if we know that the flood will be a foot higher than the FEMA requirement, the onus is on us to tell the developer during the planning process to raise their site, for example.
Yeah.
So the question is, when I asked the question earlier about what model, so we're trying to get on the same page with FEMA so that we're all, they have a HEC-RAS model that they use, and it would be a fair amount of effort to convert our model to what they use. And both of those models don't take into account the flow coming down the Neponset River during a certain rainfall event. The estuary area that we're talking about is critical, where you're getting the floods and the rainfall coming down the Neponset, and then sheet flow from each municipality through their pipe network. During the storm in 2018, I was driving around, and there was significant flood, but we noticed. So there was about 2 inches of rain before high tide and 2 inches of rain after high tide. It was a significant tide elevation of about elevation 10. And the water in the estuary was about a foot higher than the ocean. Water was flowing from the Neponset out to the flooded sea level because of the rainfall, the 2 inches of rain. So I'd like to, maybe this isn't the time to talk about it, but I'd like to get together to see how we can bring, what model is best for the municipalities in the Neponset River to try to get all on the same page. And then also we need to engage with FEMA because they're responsible for the insurance requirements.
Yeah, Paul, happy to engage with you. I'm really familiar with the ICM 2D model. I know actually the model you guys use and develop that. It's great. We probably provided boundary conditions for you without you even knowing it from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model for that. But yeah, there's tie-ins between this model specifically and what you're talking about that we can discuss further.
Yeah, maybe we could have another meeting offline.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. For example, we did the exact same thing for Boston with their, Boston Water Sewer Commission. Hazen and Sawyer is doing all their, precipitation-based storm network, piped infrastructure, stormwater system modeling, and we coordinate with them on the coastal side for the fluvial and coastal-based flooding, and tie those models together and all that. Get it kind of on the same page. They're still using more of the predecessor to ICM 2D, the PC Swim, but yeah, we use ICM on a pretty regular basis here as well. So.
Do you engage with FEMA? So we just been through another round of FEMA map updates, and they're saying that certain areas are flooding, and that we've never seen flooding before. So we've done several LOMAs, but trying to get them on the same page is what we're talking about. They're looking for the HEC-RAS modeling,
Yeah, we've done tons of HEC-RAS modeling, which is a much more simple model than what we're using here. But regardless, we work with FEMA a lot. Like we did the same reevaluation for the whole city of Boston when their initial mapping came out before it was effective, and have changed a lot of maps. We have a really high success rate on remapping FEMA maps because just understand the process. We have a lot of people that work for, develop the maps initially for FEMA. They're in the Northeast, they're never going to be right anywhere because of the way they do it with a transect based approach, which is a conversation for a different day, obviously.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Great. So for the modeling that's being done that we're talking about here, how do we interact this model with what we're seeing, say, in the North Quincy area?
Yeah, with ICM.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't want to hijack this whole meeting for that, but we can definitely have a discussion offline on another day. Paul,
Okay.
happy to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're happy to talk about this in the future. Sure.
Definitely. All right, so any more questions? Should we push ahead to the big reveal, or do we need that break for a second?
Not from the corner, but it needs it.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, so if you need a break, just wander up, or you need
Big
more
reveal.
food, just. All right, I think we're on.
Fireworks.
The big push to the big finale here.
All right. Gotta get us back to where we were. Zoom ahead here. Okay. So we're going to start with approach number 1, which Kirk sort of got us going a little bit. Which again, we're looking at the restore and adapt, keep what we have, make sure it keeps up with sea level rise. And the first approach is really our minimum recommendation after, and you'll kind of see why after we walk through all 4 of these. But this option allows for marsh to expand a little bit where it's able to and where it's already anticipated. You're also not turning over any land use changes here. It's really where the marsh would go naturally and where it's already anticipated over time by 2070. And again, we're continuing to restore and adapt the marsh that we do have through that accretion process. On the right-hand side, you can see some of those techniques that Kirk walked us through. So again, we're looking at edge control, channel mitigation, hydraulic connectivity, and then in that bright green area, those are the zones in this first approach where we would allow marsh to migrate to. So you can see in that Finnegan Park actually is one of those areas that we're thinking about letting marsh go. And in this scenario, it's a pretty minimal acreage, but again, we want to be clear that even if there's not a ton of added marsh here, in approach 1, we're looking about 77 acres compared to the existing land cover today. There's still ecological benefit in those pockets. That's a pretty large chunk. That's Quantum Point. And again, also some area around Joseph Finnegan Park that could create a new community asset or a different pocket of marsh, which has value in its own right. When we start to look at the flooding results for this approach, again in 2070, and from here on out, I know we talked earlier that for this project, we have looked at 2030 results as well, but tonight there's so much information, we really are focusing on 2070. So basically everything from here on out, keep that in mind. Under this approach 1, one of the most significant takeaways is we're looking at that area of reduction for areas that are potentially flooded at least once a month, and that's a 26% reduction. And this is compared to that no action scenario and this first recommended approach. I'm going to walk through this pretty specifically under the different flooding scenarios just for this first approach because it is our baseline recommendation. And we see a lot of benefit in these high frequency events like the monthly flooding and annual flooding. So what you're looking at here, there's kind of a lot of information. On the right-hand side, you're looking at a flood difference extent map. So everything that's blue under our projections would be flooded in 2070, whether there's no action and within this first approach of restored marsh and limited migration. Those purple areas are what we're most interested in, and that's where we are seeing flooding reduced. So that means it would have flooded under a no action scenario by 2070, but under this approach one scenario, those areas are no longer flooded. And on the left-hand side, you'll see some of those, what that means for the assets in the estuary. So for example, 43% of the residential units that were projected to flood by 2070 under no action would no longer be expected to flood every month under approach one. And same thing with the buildings. We're seeing a 36% reduction, which is equivalent to about 80 buildings that would no longer be expected to flood monthly under this approach. A 20% reduction into the transportation assets by mileage, and around a 20% reduction of open space. And again, that open space that we'll be talking about is really upland, non-marsh open space. So these are things like your public parks, your recreational points that are not tidally influenced. So really spaces that community members use that you might go to that we don't want flooded. We don't want them to be tidally influenced.
And
We're
Natalie,
gonna.
I just wanted to
Oh yeah.
point out one thing on that you didn't mention. It may look like the blue is still very blue, like most of it still floods, but I wanted to highlight the hatch that Natalie's put on it to say most of that area, that includes the river and the existing marsh. So you'll notice that most of that area that still does flood monthly, with the exception of some areas in the lower estuary, are part of that existing river, mudflat, and marsh already.
Thanks. But yeah, you'll see that kind of reoccurring. That's that sort of tidal area in 2016. So again, what you would expect to be influenced by tides. From here on out, we'll also be zooming into some different areas to really look at the areas that we're seeing the most reduction, or sometimes it's an interesting reduction. And I just want to point out that these are not the most important areas in the estuary. There's so many interesting places we could zoom around to, but we're going to focus on some of them as we move through to talk about these differences we're seeing. So here, this again is looking at the monthly flooding extent for that first approach in 2070. In some of those critical purple areas that we're seeing to no longer be expected to flood. And two of those are along Commander Shea Boulevard, a significant section here, as well as Quincy Shore. And again, these maps are looking at flooding extent, which Kirk kind of talked to earlier. That could mean an inch of water, that could mean a foot of water. And so we're starting to look at the flood depth results as well. So for some of these points on the maps, you'll see that kind of call out, we have a 0.3 foot depth reduction. So that's telling us sort of the amount of water that is being reduced, not only the extent of water in some of these maps. And what's interesting to us about this reduction is these are really key corridors to get out to Squantum Point and within the Quincy neighborhoods. And so this was a specific finding of interest for us here. Next, we're looking at sort of a similar type of information on the screen, but really looking at the annual flooding extent. So before we were looking at things that would flood maybe 12 times a year or more. Here we're looking at things that are likely to flood at least once a year. And you can see there's still fairly significant reduction, those purple areas. But you can see the percentage of assets is dropping slightly. So we're still seeing significant flooding reduction in residential units. That's 14% that would have been flooded once a year with no action. And under this approach, roughly 100 fewer units would be flooding. But the amount of reduction is slightly less than the monthly. Another area we wanted to zoom into is sort of around the State Street complex and the neighborhoods just south of that, where we see pretty significant reduced flooding across all of our approaches. So we wanted to highlight that here. Around Harriet Avenue and Division Street. Around Division Street, we have almost 2 feet a depth reduction, which is really significant for that pocket neighborhood. And you can also see 0.7 feet of depth reduction right along Heritage Drive.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in real quick here, Natalie, and say so there's one thing is that the purple areas are no longer flooded at all, right? So you just saw like a 1.7 foot reduction there, but which went from 1.7 feet of water to dry. But the other areas where you see a foot or more than half a foot of reduction in depth, that can be really significant as well. So even though it's still flooding, the potential damage or influence of that water might not be as nearly great as it was for the case where we don't restore the existing marsh, right? Because you might even get water there, but it's completely different, a couple inches versus, a foot and a half.
Yeah, you can imagine you don't want those houses to flood, but if they're, they don't have basements or if they're elevated, going down 1 foot, if it's only a couple inches, you can get through there. Also, when we think about road accessibility, 6 inches, you can drive through. 18 inches, 1.1 feet higher is something you can't drive through.
Thanks. And this idea of extent and depth will continue throughout our slides. So, anyone jump in, or if you guys have questions, please ask. In this first approach, and Kirk will kind of speak to this a little bit more explicitly, we start to see a lot less flood risk reduction benefit in those lower frequent, higher storm events, like a 10% storm or a 1% storm. So you can see here the reduction in our assets is pretty minimal. If some of these units are going to flood in a 10% storm, they're still going to flood in a 10% storm, even under this approach. Though we do have 37 acres of reduction. Some of that's happening in the golf course and one interesting area is along California Avenue, this kind of neighborhood pocket down here. And again, this is at the 10% or greater chance of flooding in a year. And that's looking at about 0.8 feet of depth reduction. So again, to Pippa's point, it's a small little neighborhood, but if you think about the 20 homes in that area, that's pretty significant reduction. And then lastly, under this first approach, we get to that 1% storm. And there's really not much impact. And Kirk will kind of walk us through maybe why that is and sort of our takeaways of this first approach.
Yeah, so key takeaways from this. And this first approach is really basically like maintaining what you have, right? So this is, very limited marsh migration. It really is about, hey, let's keep the existing marsh healthy. Let's make sure it can handle sea level rise. And what does that do for us versus if we don't do anything? And that's, that 40% reduction in buildings that are flooded versus not flooded on annual and monthly basis. And so there's really no trade-offs here, right? We're not giving up any infrastructure area to marsh. We're just saying, hey, big priority here is keep the marsh we have healthy. And that little chart on the lower left kind of illustrates that you're getting really big benefits in that dark blue and next shade down blue of flood risk reduction, because those are the frequent events that you're going to see with high tides once a month or your annual storm event. And then if you get to really big conditions, right, you're seeing less impact of that marsh because the water gets so high during those coastal storms, 100-year storm event, that the marsh is so far underwater, you can't really stop. It's not able to stop a really, really big storm event. So the marsh buys you certainly flood risk reduction in cases where you have these more frequent events and that it's less effective for the bigger storms. But let's see how that evolves as we go forward with some of the adaptations. But the real key takeaway here at the end of the day is, boy, we really need to, for both flood risk reduction and ecosystem benefits, which we're not touching on right now, keep the marsh we have. It should be the highest priority. And there's no real trade-off there, meaning I don't have to give anything up. I don't have to give up my parking lot or my buildings or anything like that. So really key first takeaway.
Okay, so beyond that sort of minimum recommendation, we're now going to jump into approaches 2, 3, and 4, which look at some of that benefit that we could get if we let marsh go a little bit further into developed areas in sort of this incremental approach. So approach number 2 is what we're calling assisted migration. So again, that marsh will move into natural areas adjacent to the marshes already, but also into some open space like parks and areas that could handle the migration. On the right-hand side, those are the areas in yellow. They're harder to see because they're small and they're disparate across the estuary. But you can see that there's a few notable areas happening in the former naval marshes, considering this area here, and as well as things like the clover leaves around 93, maybe open space that's not really used today. Like what would happen if we just let that become marsh, right? And we're interested in how that might play out. And that's pretty minimal additional acreage compared to approach 1, but it's around 100 acres compared to what we have today. So that's about a 30% increase. And you can see the marsh to open water ratio is more or less the same to approach 1 because it's pretty similar. These areas of marsh being added are fairly small, which makes sense for these takeaways, which Kirk can explain, but there's very, very little, if any, change in flood risk reduction in approach 2.
Yeah, so in this case, compared to, going from, no action to that restoring what you have to like, hey, there's some areas that we could let the marsh migrate into, which amounts to somewhere around 23 acres of additional marsh in very separated, distinct pockets. That's not enough to really make a difference. And that's what this is showing here. So it's a step that you could take for ecological reasons, right? There's benefit, there's cost associated with that, meaning cost benefits due to fisheries and other things. But it's not going to provide you any flood risk reduction at this level. So let's let it go a little bit more, see what happens.
In approach 3, expanded system migration, we do start to really look at take things like parking lots and some of these impervious surfaces, particularly ones that we expect to be flooded either daily or very, very frequently. And so you can see how that would play out on the map on the right-hand side. These are these peachy areas, kind of that orange pink hatch. And a lot of this is happening again, adjacent to where we're already growing the marsh. So we're starting to have this cumulative effect of some of those smaller areas we might have added in approach 1 or 2 begin to grow into more significant marsh areas. And you see those kind of cumulative benefits. It's also noteworthy that we're looking at taking some of those parking lots around what was formerly Sagamore Creek in the State Street complex. And again, these are not recommendations or necessarily suggestions, but areas where we see a lot of interesting opportunities for marsh to go. And in that example around Sagamore Creek, it's a really large amount of impervious surfaces to some of our earlier questions, like what would happen if that was marsh is what we're really trying to get at here. And this would add about 178 acres of marsh compared to what we have today, which again is around 300 acres. And we're starting to finally see some movement in the marsh to open water ratio that's pretty consistent to what the existing land cover is today, around 1.4, 1.5. And you can see again on the right-hand side where some of those additional areas are. And finally, we see some changes.
Yeah, so at this step, we're adding an 80 additional acres. So that's a little bit more than 23 that we added before. So again, that's why that marsh to open water ratio starts to change a little bit. And so we see some, I wouldn't say it's massive benefits, but you do see the pink areas there that have been reduced. It's about 30 additional acres of reduction. And again, it's very specific locations for the kind of these conglomerated areas where we start to make some marsh differences. I think the key thing we start to see here in these expanded locations is that, we've already kind of conquered the handling the monthly and the more frequent events, but we're now starting to see some benefit here for larger events, particularly like the 10% or 10-year return period event. You can see a jump up in some of the flood risk reductions in those areas. And that primarily has to do with because of we're putting marsh in a way where it's protecting elevations, not that are at the monthly level, meaning the monthly levels already were low enough that they were flooding anyways, but the marsh is in an area that is now adjacent to locations that are above that monthly level already. And so you're seeing the benefit of the marsh when those bigger storms come through. I would still say, though, at this level, right, we haven't had this big jump where, oh, wow, it's very clear that if we let the marsh take over this area, we're going to save, a big portion of the developed area, right? It's a pretty minor flood risk reduction benefit, really, overall. So it's not of a level where that marsh to open water ratio gets to a point where it's really severe. So what does that mean? Well, that means, like, A, if we are at a point where a parking lot is flooded every day, we could certainly turn it to marsh, right? But we don't have to necessarily make that action right now, right? Maybe there's a point we can wait till it becomes something where, boy, my marsh in my building is flooding every day, right? And then we have to think about some some kind of change, which leads us into the final step.
Yes. And before we get to approach 4, we wanted to, as Kirk said, with approach 3, we start to see some somewhat significant reduction, not as much as we'll see in a moment with approach 4. But again, to Kirk's point about what that means in terms of extent and depth. So we're zooming in here with a 10% storm, or areas that have at least a 10% chance of flooding in a year by 2070. And you can see that the purple area is kind of on the fringe. They're not huge areas of reduction, but you are still seeing fairly significant depth reduction. So that area sort of north of the State Street complex, 0.8 feet of depth reduction. And same thing with this kind of neighborhood pocket at the intersection of Wilson and Fayette, roughly a half a foot of flooding reduction. So these areas are still flooding, but we're starting to get at some of that reduction that we'll see more significantly in approach 4. So in approach 4, yeah, again, I think Kirk mentioned it earlier, we've kind of nicknamed it the Revenge of the Marsh. We've looked a lot at the historic maps of this area and where a marsh might have existed in the past or did exist in the past. And we're also looking at waterward expansion of the marsh into mudflat area to work on some of that marsh to open water ratio that we've been talking about. So in this scenario, you can see the additional marsh in the pink areas on the right. It's a lot. It's the most that we've added so far. And again, this is looking at marsh migration in different areas, regardless of what today's land use is, based on historic extents and also based on mean high water for 2070. So a lot of these areas are really dictated by where the tidal levels are expected to be then anyways. And again, these areas are not places that we necessarily plan to remove buildings. They're not a recommendation, but a really interesting point of study. And to that point, on the right-hand side, you're seeing in pink those buildings that in this scenario to test were removed and turned to marsh, which is roughly 180 buildings in the project area. But a third of those buildings are projected to be under mean high water, no matter what we do by 2070 or under that 4.3 feet of sea level rise timeframe. So that's sort of a caveat to a lot of these structures that are already really at risk, and why we might be interested in turning them to marsh. And in this scenario, we've added 350 acres of marsh, roughly doubling what exists today. And you can see we're really cranking up that marsh to open water ratio up to about 2. And here again, we just wanted to highlight that historic Sagamore Creek. It's really stark when you kind of look at what exists today and what used to exist here, into some of our earlier conversation around development and what's permitted and what's allowed in public policy. You know, this development specifically, until the 1960s was marsh and wouldn't be legal or permitted today as it is. So these are things that we've watched shift over large timelines and sometimes happen really fast and in very specific points in time, and which is why we're interested in not seeing that. I'm gonna exit out. I think something happened with my PDF. Why we're interested in I'm not sure. I didn't see this when I flipped open earlier.
You can still read the map.
You can still read it.
The map got inserted. It's there.
I'm sorry, guys. For some strange reason, I think some of our notes turned on this page only, which has never happened to me. But to Pippa's point, I think the easiest is just to leave that draft watermark. Well, Kirk, do you want to take us through our takeaways?
Yeah, sure. So just here's this kind of the final takeaways for this case, right? Which again, I want to make this clear. This isn't a recommendation to do this, right? We're looking at what's happening here in these cases. So this case adds 172 acres of additional salt marsh. For just thinking about the areas that you get, and they kind of work together now. And one of the big key things we're looking at is water comes into the system. What does it have? What kind of does it have to get through? And the marsh now is a more complete joined section. And then you can see in the final bar graph, we're really starting to see an impact on those, you know, the 10-year type condition, which is that second bar in there, showing that you're really getting some flood risk reduction at that level for these bigger types of events based on, you know, expansion of that marsh, getting that ratio up even higher to a level of 2. And again, this is areas where marsh will live, right? Because the elevations are correct, but upland of that, you get kind of pretty high elevations. And so monthly, it doesn't really, it gets the marsh wet, but not that land anyways. And in the no action case, it was flooding up into that area, but now the marsh is able to minimize some of that during those larger storm events. So you're starting to see benefits at bigger storm events for that marsh condition, which I myself was kind of a little surprised with. But it just illustrates that there's that kind of tipping point, where if you get to a point where sea level rises at a point where, man, I'm flooding a lot, say State Street every day, right? Translating that to marsh may in fact help the neighbors upstream of that or upland of that pretty substantially. And again, that's not something that has to happen soon or tomorrow or anything like that. But as we go forward in time, it's something that needs to be considered and just shows the value of the salt marsh in that case.
Yeah, and highlighting that specifically, again, this is the 1% storm areas that are expected to be have a 1% chance of flooding in a year. And again, the extent is fairly similar, although we do see a huge pocket that's not flooding anymore north of that rail line. But when we look at the depths, especially, we see huge amounts of reduction that we didn't see in approach 3 even, and certainly not in approaches 1 or 2. So even a 2-foot depth reduction along that Division Street area, that's still expected to flood, but to our earlier conversation, is really notable. And as well as around North Quincy T Station, it's still expected to flood to some amount of water, but a 3-foot depth reduction in our projections, which is really interesting. And that sort of takes us home to some of our larger takeaways about all of these approaches. I know we went through that fairly quickly, but on the right-hand side, you can see those charts that we've been looking at of the approaches, as well as sort of the acreage of marsh that was compared to existing that we've added in order to get some of those flood reduction benefits. Kirk, I don't know if you want to reiterate some of these final takeaways.
Yeah, sure. Just real quick. I think that bottom number with the acres of marsh added, like the key thing to think about is the delta between them or the difference between the two. So when you go from that first limited migration case to the assisted migration, you added 23 acres. That just isn't doing much. It's doing nothing really. And then you add 78, you start to do a little bit more, you add 100 something, right? And now all of a sudden you get some pretty big impacts. Overall, I think what we learned through this process is that the key, most important thing is that taking care of the existing marsh, making sure it's healthy, it can adapt over time, clearly has the biggest benefit, especially for stuff that happens frequently. Without that, you're really in a critical situation, whether it's frequent flooding or storm-based flooding. So maintaining the existing, adapting the current marshes is the first key step. The second thing we learned is, we thought maybe incremental little steps of marsh in certain areas might provide some benefit, but it really doesn't provide any flood risk reduction benefit. Does provide ecosystem value, right? There's value in saying, hey, it might be more important to turn this into marsh than try to protect it. There might be a cost associated with protecting it with limited usage, right? Especially if it's flooding every day or once a month, right? And the value of the ecology might be more, but it's not going to provide specific flood reduction benefits. And then the final point is, like, if we ever get to a point where we want to think about large scale migration and as well as maintaining what you have, that seems to then provide that uptick in flood risk reduction benefits, as well as the ecosystem values for the whole system. So those are just some of the key takeaways that we learned throughout the process.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's it. That's the big reveal of our 4 approaches. We're happy to take some questions, go back through any of those slides. We have some discussion prompts, but I'm sure people might have some things they want to ask first.
Go right ahead. I'm Keith Johnson. I'm also an LSP, so and I know many of you or your firms that you're working with. So I'm looking at the 2 big areas, the large scale expansions, and the State Street, and then the warehouses. One of them started out, I think it was a Jordan Marsh warehouse. I think it was probably built in the 70s. And so, and the State Street development, I know is probably in the 80s or maybe the 70s. I'm trying to remember now, but these buildings are getting to the point where they're almost past their usable life anyway. And I'm wondering by 2030, things are plus with the insurance rates going up. I'm thinking fire sale here for a lot of developers or building owners. And that's just reality because when you add it all up, so we need to be on the lookout for these potential. Maybe there's a way if they were to turn over their property or the building. I mean, it's probably not without cost, but some cost sharing and things like that. So I'm just kind of projecting ahead. But I think that's something that we should really keep in mind because these are really older buildings where we get the most bang for the buck. Just a thought.
I think it's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes into play here over the mid to long term thinking, right, is exactly what you mentioned, service life of infrastructure, right? And then I think policy related to that, do you allow redevelopment or refurbishment of those structures in these areas? Could that be repurposed in a different way? What's going to happen with that? I mean, I think you make good points for sure.
I think it also highlights something that Kirk pointed out that this is, it's not decisions to be made tomorrow. It's like these are long-term processes. We're looking at 2070 or beyond. You don't need to convert the marsh today. And so that thinking about the useful life of buildings, right? This is just, one more consideration as a building reaches its end of useful life. Now there's a resource to say, oh, is this an area not only that would flood, but that might actually benefit flood risk reduction or create a connected marsh ecosystem. So I think different ways that you might be able to use the results of this study in long-term planning is, how we want it to be useful.
Yeah. It's like Stella might have had a question in the chat there.
Yeah, so Stella asked, does it matter where you, oh my God.
The ones we had approved,
I've lost the mouse, but I think it says, does it matter where you add or add marsh? Yeah.
Does it matter where?
Right.
Yeah, the easy answer to that is yes. So for example, you can see in the picture that Natalie has up, or the map Natalie has up right now, we're saying, hey, let's let marsh go in between the on-off exit ramps of, the highway 93 there, those yellow circle areas. That is marsh ecosystem value, but isn't really going to do anything for flood risk reduction at all, right? The highway's really high there. It's not really going to provide any value. Meanwhile, big, large, expansive areas of pink in certain locations, in purple, that is going to have some benefit. So yeah, there is some where it occurs that matters. One of the things we were looking at specifically here, though, is regional impact. So that marsh to open water ratio is that regional piece, right? And as you go up the estuary, that continual marsh effect has a bigger role. So that's one other thing we're looking at. So it does matter, but it is also kind of looked at from a regional perspective, if that makes sense.
I think two examples that speak to that, Kirk, is the case 2. If you just look at all the yellows, when we added those a little bit everywhere, there wasn't much of a difference. And so, that large contiguous marsh, but the regional effect, Kirk, I wanted to point out, one of the things that we did see is as, once we got to case 3 and 4, you did see additional flood risk reduction benefits up around the upper estuary marshes, right? But if you look at these, we didn't actually change the extent of restoration or expand that marsh that much. So Kurt, correct me if I'm wrong, but what that was actually the regional effect of that cumulative restoration contributing to that flood extent reduction.
Yep, that's correct. Yep.
Well, when you talk about the area that's by the on-ramps and off-ramps of 93, You also have the issue that it's the state Department of Public Works. I don't know what their title is exactly that, but they're right there. They're on what probably was marshland at some point. And you have to say, you need land that was that big. I mean, they have a big chunk of land that's there. And it was like, if that could be consolidated all in the future, if they decided they didn't need that much land, could that area be incorporated back into the marsh? That might make a big difference, especially at that area that does tend to have high water coming to it.
And that area
Or
did make a difference.
else there.
Yeah, although I think the lot you're talking about there that's sort of in orange and purple, that was the Mastow lot, I think is going back to the town of Milton, and the town has just zoned it for like 400 residential units. Which is a little unclear to me if they actually intend to build that, but.
Wow.
Right. It's the kind of thing
Yeah.
that is a concern, that is like, some of the things are long-term, but it's the decisions that people make now that could be smarter decisions for the long run.
Right.
But just putting it there for the sake of getting the tax dollars for it hurts the community so much more.
Exactly. Do other people have comments or thoughts? You know what, one question I was interested about is, this notion of trying to keep the marsh where it is, not even necessarily expanding it, and the benefit of that. Which sounds kind of like, oh, easy. It's actually not easy, but one of the things I wondered about is how people think about the benefit of moving like some buildings or some roads from flooding 12 times a year to flooding once a year. Right? Like it's still flooding once a year, right? It's like you're not going to get flood insurance with a conventional 30-year mortgage, but is that enough of a benefit that's meaningful to people, and is that sort of buying you some time maybe before you have to, spend $1 bazillion on elevating Commander Shea Boulevard or something like that? Or is that just sort of people poo-poo that because it's not, well, you haven't solved my 100-year flood problem, so I don't care.
That's a very good point. So we're looking at elevating roads, which is why Conoco is actually on this call. The mayor's looking at 4 specific areas. You've hit on 3 out of the 4. It's a matter of getting the DPW of the mayor's office, planning department, the natural resources department, the DCR, and MassDOT all on the same page. We can do that. We can do that through the planning department. But we need to get the models talking to each other so we all know what elevations of flooding we're talking about. For what year storm is rainfall being considered? Do we need to upgrade our drainage system, the pipe network? So there's a lot of engineering that goes into it as well. I think the first step is taking a look at the models and all agreeing to the storm that we're looking at, that we're designing to, and then see what needs to be done. It's going to be a combination of DPW projects, raising roads, changing pipe networks, seawalls. We're doing that as well. Expanding the estuary. And planning board. Stopping development potentially, or changing development. Telling developers what criteria they need to design to.
Great. Looks like Sarah has a hand up.
Yeah, just something that Paul said made me think a little bit about the idea of raising roads or removing roads from the flood inundation area versus some of the areas that I think you focused on in this presentation were, homes, yards, and other buildings. And I wonder if when we talk about elevating roadways, if all the project does is focus on keeping that transportation road open, but doesn't necessarily do anything for the homes and businesses that get flooded adjacent, is that enough? Or like, what does the community want to see? Like, would the community rather see the roadway adjusted and then kind of building level adaptation is less of a concern? Or is the community more interested in like protecting the homes and businesses from flooding and maybe more willing to accept, yeah, the road is closed for a day or two as floodwater is there and then recedes? I wonder if that could be something we learn a little bit about how the public would respond to, not that we're talking either or, but just to sort of understand where people place their value.
We deal with this on a regular basis now. The city has done 160 million of road work in the last 7 years, and a lot of that has been mitigating flooding through roadway projects. We upgrade the drainage system. So it's always, we always try to design as best we can to minimize flooding of private property. Always. Now, there's a cost benefit analysis that needs, along the coastline, a lot of repetitive lost property. We built $18 million worth of seawalls to save. So there's a lot of money that goes into, at some, if we look at the 2070 flooding that's anticipated, at some point it may be, you have to take property and look at those losses. But it's that someone has to decide what storm interval and flooding, including rainfall, that we're designing to, and then make key critical decisions.
Yeah. Those are important points, Paul. And Sarah, I think your question is a very, important one that this raises. But in reaction, Paul, in conjunction with what you're saying, I think what this illustrates is, wherever the exact water levels are, what elevation are decided on, or what model we use, that it's showing that the marshes are kind of reducing that frequency, right? And then essentially reducing the elevation. So that might change the number of roads that have to be raised, or how high they have to get raised, or if not, if you build a flood wall or not, how high it has to be. And I think, the impact on the transportation infrastructure, I think, was one of the most surprising findings to me, that it had this big impact on something that, was operational for emergency response, things like that. And also having, doing flood adaptation design, knowing that road raisings are really hard, not only because of cost, but because of adjacent land uses, right? So it might be easy to raise it a foot, but 2 feet is a real lift. And so changing that dynamic seemed, one of the key areas. So I think it'd be interesting, Sarah, along your lines of your question, could that change the game? Would that be something to factor into the planning and decision making, but also the costing of some of these measures?
Yeah, we have to consider that the city of Quincy, we're dealing with that issue on C Street, out to Howes Neck, the causeway out to Squantum. They're major thoroughfares that may have to be raised. There's a significant cost with that. State Street area, Commander Shea Boulevard, Quincy Shore Drive. They all fall under that same category.
And Pippa, just for my benefit, if you need to raise the road 2 feet, why does that become so hard? Is that because like every driveway that's trying to get onto that street can't be
Yeah,
45?
Right.
That was
The
an arbitrary
property,
number, but yeah,
yeah.
especially for urban roadways.
the
Yeah.
property
Under the
adjacent to the roadway,
gas
if it's 2
lines, you
feet,
go,
if it's
All
2
the
feet,
infrastructure.
Do you have
you
to
have
change,
the
like,
runoff.
you'd have, yeah, Paul, one of the major things is the Squantum Causeway. I know we just did a whole bunch of new telephone poles there. Half of them were leaning over because of the settlement. I mean, that was filled in over marsh, so you get settlement over time, and that's the other thing. It isn't just sea level, but it's a settlement over time, and then
land going
and
down?
then you've got the water line, you've got the gas lines, and those are not pile supported. They're just kind of like floating there. So if you raise the grade on, say, the causeway that's going out to Squantum, then those utilities are at risk. So you might have to pile support those utilities, and that's the cost that I think Paul's getting at.
Right.
Right, Paul?
Newport Ave extension's a perfect example. There's a 4-foot diameter culvert that's on piles.
Right.
But the road itself was
Yeah.
built on peat,
Mm.
so there's a huge hump in the road. And if you're raising roads and putting sidewalks in, everything has to be ADA accessible.
Yep.
So you got runoff, stormwater. If you raise the road and the surrounding neighborhood is lower and we get a heavy rain, then the neighborhood will be prone to flooding. Water has no place to go. So
Yeah,
we're looking
Paul,
at
that's
pump.
kind of what I was talking about, Paul, because like sometimes with a road raising project, you can't accommodate any flood risk reduction in the adjacent lands. In fact, sometimes it makes it worse or more complicated in terms of the inland flooding. And so that's what I was asking about in terms of what's more important here is like reducing the flooding to the properties or getting the roadway high and dry. And sometimes if it's an either or, how do we place value on that from the whole of community perspective? Like what does the community want to see in that regard?
Well, the community will want to protect their structures. And they will want the community, to be honest with you, will want both.
Right.
They're going to want an escape route for a major catastrophe, and they want to make sure their houses don't flood, period. Pump stations could be a consideration.
And I think what this talks about is obviously there's gray infrastructure that we will likely need to be invested in over time, but the marsh restoration and adaptation could be part of like a layered approach, right? So Sarah, that's a really important point you made. The road raising doesn't do anything to the buildings, but if you raised a road in conjunction with making sure that marsh kept up with sea level rise and lowered the overall extent of flooding, right? Maybe that road stays drier for longer and you see some flood risk reduction around the buildings. And so I think that's one of the opportunities to this type of intervention. I think the other thing that's interesting about the road raisings is especially with all the elevated roads and the causeways, there are definitely going to be impacts, right, to raising causeways. And what if the mitigation for that, in the regulatory sense, actually could contribute to the flood risk reduction as well?
Yeah, I think Issa had
Just quick, just a lot of these roads, I feel like in terms of like the cost benefit analysis, you were to place like an economic value on one of these important roads that not just people in the neighborhoods use, but people in the whole city use, and people in the surrounding cities use to get into Boston and get back. What would it cost for everyone to miss a day of work? What would it cost for decreased workforce? What would the mental headache of that cost? So I think the roads for transportation are very important, not even just to Quincy or the neighborhoods, but as an area.
And the businesses that would have to close down.
Right.
Yes, business.
That's a very good point. Right now, there's a certain reactiveness to what's happening. Under some storm scenarios, How's Neck will flood, a major coastal storm. Under some scenarios, the Furnace Brook area will flood, and we've been dealing with the DCR on that. That's a heavy rainfall. And Town Brook will flood under heavy rainfall conditions. So different areas flood for different reasons, and different people are impacted. So we need to take a holistic look at the city and do a risk reward analysis citywide and prioritize certain projects and work with the state and DCR and MassDOT to help out.
And in the
And funding.
And in the context of a process, I mean, having listened to this conversation, when I started this conversation, I thought, you know, flooding once a year instead of 12 times a year, it's still too much flooding. And obviously it is, but I'm sort of picturing like the city needing to raise roads all over the entire city and not being able to do that in a short period of time. And, you know, the notion of, well, maybe if we can do some marsh restoration in the meantime, and it's cheaper than pile supported culverts, you know, and it allows us to have a road that floods once a year, only 6 inches deep instead of 12 times a year, 10 inches deep, then maybe that does start to seem worthwhile if it just allows you to lengthen the amount of time you have to raise all these roads.
Yeah. So this past spring, the roads that you pointed out, Commander Shea Boulevard, State Street, they flooded 4 times this past spring.
Yeah.
All right. We're not seeing significant property damage. We're seeing less flooding of people's homes. System much better. So if a road is flooded for 4 hours, then the tide goes out and we're fine again. In some areas, that's okay. For Quincy Shore Drive, that would not be okay because you're dealing, as somebody pointed out, traffic getting over Neponset Bridge into Boston is very, very heavy, and you'd impact a lot more people. So that would be a priority area. The Division and the Division Street area. The concern with flooding there is that it inundates the sewer system, and we're seeing a lot of II into the sewer system. There's a drainage pump station down there that gets inundated, and so in these areas, the municipal roads that are getting flooded, it's having a significant impact on the sewer system. So we're lining sewer and drain pipe in all those neighborhoods right now to limit the impact of flooding. The last thing we want is the sewer system to overflow and sewage into the Neponset River.
You're right. I'm realizing are we like 20 minutes over time here? Are we supposed to end at 8:30 or 8? Oh, I thought we were.
We've got 7 minutes left.
7 minutes left.
7 minutes.
I won't be able to sleep tonight.
But I think the prompt that Paul really Paul has really emphasized is the extent and cost of not just the infrastructure adaptation from big storms, but from regular flooding. And so I think, there's, Ian, to your point, there's often a sort of feeling that, oh, well, it's too expensive to do marsh restoration or adaptation, right? But if we factor in, if we start thinking about it, not just the costs of restoration, I'd be interested in what the larger group thinks of how this might, reframe the value of the marshes in the Neponset Estuary, even if that impact is only those frequent flooded storms.
No, that's right. I think, taking care of the marshes is a fraction of the cost it would take to elevate one roadway, probably. I mean, you can't even make the comparison. So I totally agree.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of getting the DPW. The city of Quincy has a natural resources department that's very good. Getting everybody in the
Mhm.
same room and balancing. We're chasing grants all the time to do this type of work. But the Chapter 90 roadway program hasn't been funded, increased for many, many years now. So there's not a lot of money for roadway improvements out there.
Just as a side note, what are the benefits of enhancing the marshes, which I don't think was on your list, was, we have a lot of uh, EPA and DEP at disposal. So along the Neponset River, I can think of at least a couple that I've worked on personally. And with the sea level rise, we have issues where it could be pushing contamination into the river, and that's we're actually required as LSPs to look at this now when we reach a permanent solution on a site, is to look at those mitigation factors and what it would take. So, looking at the John Paul Park,
Pope
sorry,
John Paul.
Pope John Paul Park, and other sites I know, but I won't name along the river. We could have issues in that regard as well. So that's a benefit of anything we do. I'd add it to your list.
Noted, thanks.
And in the interest of trying to finish on time, anybody have other issues, questions, observations, feelings they want to raise?
I was just gonna say one last thing, which is that, again, I think you've emphasized repeatedly that these are not recommendations for the follow-up stuff, but the way it does work out is restore what we have, adapt to the changing elevation, and then work towards it. So the conversations, the really hard conversations around buildings, if we do the first part, we have a little bit of time to work on.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
And if,
Yeah.
we probably should have brought at the end, but the map that I started with in the beginning showed the sort of relative health of the estuary. So, keeping the marsh you have, it's not all the same, right? Some of it is doing well, but some of it might need to start pretty soon.
I think that a lot of the things that when you talk about the flooding and when it's going towards homes or businesses, that's the other part about what can you do creating an environment where water, when it starts to flood, is going into dirt versus, I think that the more buildings that go up, they go in a smaller footprint and the parking lot is underneath and the building is above. But then there's another place that's next door to it that's doing the same thing. So it's sort of just changing if that water's gonna go out past the river, and where is it gonna go? And what's that effect gonna keep going? Because it's gonna keep going closer, further out. The more things it can just not seep into, it's gonna go further into the communities.
This is true. So Sean, do you wanna, so this is probably the last CAC meeting of the first part of this project, but it's hopefully not the end of, it's maybe the end of the beginning as opposed to the beginning of the end. Do you want to just talk quickly about sort of what the next steps are in terms of wrapping this project up, in terms of a little more public outreach we've been thinking about, and then also sort of where this maybe goes next?
Yeah, so as Ian said, this is kind of the end of phase one, as we'll call it. And what's really helpful is to kind of hear from you all about what issues are of concern in these areas and how kind of foresee, as Sarah was getting to, like, do Is it about elevating the roadway? Is it about saving the neighborhood? If you have to make those tough calls. So we appreciate your feedback today. I'll still follow up with everyone via email and get some more thoughts. But our goal is to wrap this up by the end of the calendar year. And Paul, yes, we'll send out the presentation. We'll send the video and the slides. And our goal is to wrap this up with a nice report. As Ian mentioned at the top, there's a lot of data in here. We tried to slim it down to get into 2 hours, but there's a lot of things that we want to write up. And then where we go with this next is looking to actually start implementing some of the stuff, especially this restoration of the marshes. So we've already reached out to so Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs about some of their CZM grants or MVP grants, which might be able to fund this project. And obviously have conversations. A lot of this land is owned by DCR, so it's going to involve a lot of conversations about what the best path forward for that is, and if it's state money, private money, federal money, limited federal money that there is. But it's kind of where we're at now is we're looking for the funding for the next steps.
Right. And then hopefully
just to add to that, and thank you for that summary, MassDOT too. I think a lot of the land holdings in this area are not just DCRs, and I'd love to invite other, major voices to the table as well. I'm sure that folks were invited. It's hard to come on an evening meeting, but just making sure that as a part of those next steps that we try to drill in on some of those key landowners as well.
Sarah, I think that's a really important one, particularly because the results we've seen and the benefit to roadway flooding as well.
And then we're also talking about maybe trying to do this has been I feel like this has been a good process. We've sort of been on a journey, and if you had just randomly shown up tonight and had never heard about any of this, it would probably be very befuddling. So we're glad you've kind of come on a journey with us. I think now that we have some results, we're thinking we're going to do at least one sort of just general public meeting for anybody who's interested and try to explain it in a way that somebody can take it all in one setting, which maybe it'll be February.
Yeah, we're still working
sort of been talking about. We're
calendar.
working on the dates, but so. All right, so you'll hear from Sean.
Yeah.
We'd love more input, and another interesting question that maybe Sean can ask about over email too is what would be a useful final product for people here? I mean, there will be some level of report. One of the things that I think is fascinating here is there are so many interesting little corners of the estuary where different things are happening, and every little neighborhood has its own little story to tell. So we'll be thinking about how is there a way to, I don't know, put this together that allows people to kind of zoom in on their little corner of the universe. So, but if folks have thoughts on that.
And just a thing is in outcome kind of pieces and moving forward. It sounds like Quincy is really very much into this and getting very organized. It would have to be like to Boston and Milton to say, what can you do to contribute to this? Using this, like actually having something, because I know there's a lot of different agencies within the city of Boston and they all have their own pieces of it, but getting the thought about what they each can do towards encouraging the health and well-being of the estuary and the river. I think it has to be put to them a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
When this presentation was done with Boston. And
well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, they're not here tonight, but
yeah, we did.
We did a municipal preview last week, although probably we explained it, I think, a lot more slowly and smoothly this time. So yeah, but you guys may understand it better than them.
Seeing residents. Now, the crazy thing is, I don't want to be partial or stereotypical, but most of the people who are on the CAC and officials are actually probably retired. So there's potential of seeing at some point, maybe something that was during the day that more of the agencies could all be together and have something like that, which I think you would have still as high a percentage of participation from the community members.
Yeah. Or if anybody has suggestions for like, hey, you should really come talk about this with group X.
Yeah.
We'd be interested in hearing your suggestions.
And I think with that, it's like say coming to Cedar Grove, which
Yeah.
is where I first met you, is that they would be very, okay, the broader picture, but then tell me how this affects me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, and you could probably we're sort of doing the show everybody the entire area version here, but you could do a version that's like, okay, here's just Cedar
Yeah.
Grove.
Yeah, neighborhood.
Right, which would be a lot easier to digest. for
Yeah.
people.
And I think effective to get the thing, this is affecting you. And when people hear that, I think it makes a difference.
Great. All
Thank
right,
you.
well, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you guys.
And take home some cookies and fruit and salad. Thank you to everybody online.
Thanks.
Thank
Any
you
closing-
all. Thanks for the feedback.
Oh, they're done.
John?
That's a long.
Off.
Yeah.